Welcome to the next video in the series on creating a simple purchase order system using Blazor, Syncfusion controls and Dapper. In this video, we'll look at the page to add supplier information, one of the three fairly static lookup pieces of data that we'll be using when adding a purchase order. This is going to be following pretty much the same pattern as we used for tax rates. So it'll involve changing SQL stored procedures and changing the C# code for the supplier service, the supplier interface, and then adding the supplier page. There is one change that I intend to make though, or an improvement. This is the data grid that is how the suppliers will appear to start with. I'm intending to have the supplier name, the supplier address line 1, and an email address. But I think looking at this, it would be better if instead of having supplier address line 1, we were able to have the whole supplier address, the various address lines concatenated into one particular field. So this is what we're going to be aiming for. We're going to have the address shown on the data grid as a single item, and we're also going to tackle another of my pet hates, which is postcodes. If a postcode is going to be in uppercase, the user shouldn't need to worry about making it in uppercase. It should go into uppercase automatically, and we'll also look at a way of achieving that. Right, let's get started and look at the SQL. If you haven't done so already, open SQL Server Management Studio. We need to replace the supplier insert, supplier list, and supplier update stored procedure. And I've already got some scripts to do that, so I'll be cheating a little bit. So open a new query, and I've got these in Notepad++. And I can just copy and paste them. So what this does is it uses the purchase orders database, and it then drops the supplier insert stored procedure that already exists. Then the create procedure basically passes in these parameters. Notice that there's no need to pass in the supplier ID or supplier is archived. Supplier ID will be automatically generated by the system, and supplier is archived will automatically default to 0, meaning live. So we're declaring a result value, which will be passed back to our C# code, and then the stored procedure checks to see if it can find a supplier already where the supplier name is the same as the supplier name being passed in, and where that supplier is live, i.e. is not archived. If it finds one, it sets the result value to 99, otherwise it does the insert. Then if the result is not equal to 0, i.e. 99, it rolls back, otherwise it commits the transaction. The code for this and the other stored procedures and the C# code will be in the Blazor code website, and I'll link to in the description. Right, so that's that done. I'll just parse it and execute it. That's fine. So now we'll move on to the update query. And this follows exactly the same format as for the insert. It's checking this time though where the supplier name is the same as the supplier name passed in, and the supplier ID is not the same as the supplier ID passed in, i.e. it's a different supplier, and also that the supplier is live, i.e. is not archived. So let's execute that. And lastly, we need the list one. And this simply lists out the suppliers where the supplier is archived is set to 0, i.e. is live, and it orders it by the supplier name and in ascending sequence. So I'll just run that. So that's the stored procedures all done. And now we need to tackle the supply service, the supplier service interface, and then we can move on to the supplier page itself. So let's have a look at the C# code. I'll open the supplier service to start with, and the insert, supplier insert, is still using the old stored procedure which passes back a Boolean. We're passing back that success ID, which was either going to be 0 or 99. So I need to replace this. I'll delete it, and I'll copy that in here. So this is basically doing the same thing, except we're now responding to the integer being passed back from the stored procedure. So we're inserting it as before. We're declaring an integer called success and setting it to 0, setting out the parameters, running the SQL, and then it's returning success, which will either be 0 or 99. And that value there is then passed back to the rest of the C# code. That's for the insert. We mustn't forget the update. So I'll delete the update method. And replace it with that one. What have I done? I've forgotten a curly bracket somewhere. Right, I think that's fixed it. We've still got the problem of the supplier service interface, so we can sort that out. So if we open the supplier service interface, iSupplier service, and this time we want to delete that because we'll be passing in the parameters and it's an integer, not a Boolean, being passed back. And we need to do the same for the update. Remove that. And replace it with this. So in the case of the insert, we're saying that a task is dealing with an integer, and then we're passing in the various strings for the supplier name, etc., 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 and the same for supplier update, where we're also passing in the supplier ID and the Boolean supplier is archived. That's it. We save those. Let's save both of those. And the next thing we have to do is create the supplier page. This is going to be almost identical to the tax rates page. So we can take advantage of that by, first of all, creating a new page. To create a new page, I right-click on the Pages folder, select Add, raise a component, and I'm going to call it Supplier Page. There it is. And because it's going to be very, very similar to the tax page, what I'm going to do is go to the tax page and copy the whole lot. So Control-A to highlight it all, Control-C, back to the supplier page, Control V to paste. I'm going to use find and replace, and I'm going to take uppercase tax and replace it with supplier. I'm going to make sure that it matches the case and I'm only changing the current document. Then I can just replace all. And that's changed tax into supplier. Now I also want to change lowercase tax into lowercase supplier. And I'll repeat. And that's finished. Now we're not home and dry though. The columns in the grid are going to be different, and the text boxes in the add edit supplier are going to be different. So the columns we want in the grid are going to be, say, the supplier name, the supplier address, and the supplier email. So I have to change the data here, the text there, to say supplier name, and change that just to say name. That one we want supplier, it's just address 1. We don't want it to say rate, we want it to say address. We want it left aligned, not right aligned. And we don't want any special formatting. And we probably want them all to have the same width, so I'll change that to 40. And we want another column for the supplier email address. I'll just copy that and paste it underneath. And edit that so it says email. Ooh, I can't spell address. Or can't type it anyway. That should say email. Right, that looks okay. For the actual dialog where we're going to be editing the supplier, basically we want the name, the 3 address lines, the postcode, and the email address. So let me get rid of this numeric text box because we don't need that. And the first thing we want is the supplier name. So I'll put supplier name. Float label, I'm going to have as auto, I think. That might look a little bit better. And that needs to be changed to name. So that's the first text box. The next is basically the same, except it's address. Now what we've got coming up is address line 1, 2, 3. It might be better if we have those all as one block. And the way we can do that is if I have that and leave that as always. Or perhaps we'll have it as auto. No, auto. Change my mind. And that is address 1. So it's going to say address, it's going to be automatic, and it's address 1. Right, now we want to repeat that for address 2 and 3. Except I'm going to have never there. That way we don't see the placeholder. And I'm going to repeat that again for the postcode. Except I'm going to change my mind, as usual, and have that as auto, I think. And lastly, we need the email. I'll have that as auto, and that needs to be email. Right, so it's looking a bit messy. Maybe I can tidy that up. So going through, when we delete, we want to show basically the same information as on the supplier, the edit. So what I'm going to do is copy all that lot and replace the contents here. Except this time I don't want them to be enabled. I just want to display the fields rather than allowing the user to change anything. So I'm just copying and pasting. Right. Couple more things. The search and replace. I didn't change tax rate. I just changed tax. So we've got rate sitting in one or two places here that we don't really want. Again, I think probably search and replace could have dealt with this more efficiently than I'm dealing with it. Right, on the supplier save, we need to pass in the fields for the supplier. So if it's an ad, we want the supplier name, address 1. Right. I think I'm going to make this slightly easier to read. Address line 2, address line 3, postcode, and email. We've got the same where it's being edited, so I can probably just select all that. And we can use the same again here for the delete. This time we're passing in archived is true to make sure this is the delete procedure. That will delete it. So let's see. That looks okay. So I'll save that and we'll run it. But I forgot to add the menu item. Let's just deal with that while we can. So on shared nav menu, we want one of these copied, and we want it to go to supplier. Save that and run it again. Right, so let's look at suppliers. So we've got the data grid. Let's try adding a record. And that's not entirely what I intended. We'll come back to that in a minute. Let's have a supplier called Paper Stationers. And where should we have them? For High Street, Salisbury, postcode SA2 5. Now, first thing we notice is that those are lowercase, not very satisfactory. And that's sales at paper.co.uk. Save. And there's our supplier. We can edit it once I've selected it. Again, I might change that message to say either select or reselect. Maybe what's happening there? Always good to test your system. We must have the wrong item in the edit there. So let's cancel that and close, and we'll go back to the code. and what have we got? Supplier name, address 2, address 3, address 3. That's why. So that should be postcode. And I didn't want these addresses coming up all the time, so let's just get rid of those. Getting carried away there. That's what we want, I think. Right, try again. Try editing it. Of course, but that's now gone into that that field, even though it's not what we wanted. It's actually been written to the database. So, and it didn't get posted to the postcode. So SA2, I'm making this up as I go along. Save. Right, now we go back to highlight it again, edit, and everything's in the right place, except we've got postcode in lowercase. So the first thing I think we want to tackle is making those postcodes uppercase. So let's save that, and we'll close that for the moment. Now there are two ways of doing that. The first is that we can tackle it at the SQL level by making sure that anything that's written to postcode goes in uppercase. So we'll have a look at that first. So go back to SQL, and we're looking at the stored procedure. For supplier insert, let's modify that. And we can get around the problem by just making sure that whenever we write to the postcode that it goes into upper characters. So to do that, I think we'll need to do is upper postcode. So that will, whenever it writes into the supplier table with postcode, it'll be converted to upper. So let's execute that. And the other one is update, supplier update. Let's modify that and change that to upper. Execute. Right, try again. First of all, I'm going to edit that and save it. And if I refresh, let's see if that's changed it. Yes, so it's because we've done an update, it's updated it from lowercase to uppercase, so the database is showing it correctly. If we try adding another one, postcode I'm going to enter in lowercase. I'm making these up, by the way. So save, close it. Let's have a look at Rathbones again, edit. It's in uppercase, but it would be nice, the next stage is that it would be nice to actually convert it to uppercase as the user types it in. And we can do that by changing some CSS styling on the dialog. So I'll close that, and what we need to do is change the postcode. So we've got a CSS class in there. So if I type in CSS class equals, and let's call it to uppercase, and further down before the code here, we want to put this code in. And that should change the anything we enter in there into uppercase as we enter it. So let's give it one more go. We'll add a new supplier. I always have terrible difficulty thinking of who to put in. Let's have Kelly's Motor Parts. $36. Now when I come into the postcode, the moment I start typing, it should go into uppercase, and it does. Save. Now, the other thing that I'm not really happy about here is that the address doesn't really give us much of a clue as to where the supplier might actually be. And what I think would be really nice is if we could have the whole address displayed with commas between the fields. There is a way to do that, and it involves adding something to the SQL list stored procedure so that it combines the address lines into one concatenated string. So let's have a look at that. We can close these, don't need these. And supplier list, and if I can modify that. Now they say that 95% of code actually comes from Stack Overflow or the internet one way or another, and that users just change it to help themselves. So what I'm going to do is add a new field in here. I'm going to put a comma there, start a new line. I'm going to give myself a bit of space, and I'm going to copy in this code, which I shall try and explain. And this is something I've just acquired from Stack Overflow. It's not my own work by any means. And so we're introducing a new field called combine address, and it's comprised of a number of different commands. One that says stuff, and I'll come to that in a minute, coalesce, comma, space, plus rtrim supplier address 1. So if we take it from the inside out, rtrim will right trim this field supplier address 1, and it'll remove any trailing spaces. Coalesce will add comma space and then supplier address 1. And it uses the fact that coalesce and plus, if something is a null and you add something to it, it will still be null. So comma space plus null will be null. So we will end up with comma space and the supplier address 1. If supplier address 2 exists, it'll have comma space address 2, and so on and so forth. If, on the other hand, we leave out supplier address 3, that line effectively won't appear because something plus a null will be null. Stuff, which is a marvelous command, takes 4 parameters, if I remember rightly. It takes an input string, which will be all this lot. It takes a starting position, a length, and a new string. And it takes the original string, it starts at position 1, and for however many digits you've got here, it will replace that length with whatever we've got here, which is in this case nothing. So effectively what that does is, since we've got the comma and the space before supplier address 1, it'll start at position 1, which is the comma. It'll use up 2 positions, which will be the comma and the space, and it'll replace it with nothing. So that will now produce a new combined address, which will be the concatenated address lines. So let's execute that. And back in the C# code, we need to do 2 things. In the supplier model, we just need to add public string. Let's call it combined address. And we'll only ever be getting that. Save that. And on the supplier page, on our data grid, we can replace supplier address with combined address. And maybe give it a touch more space. The other thing we can do while we're here is this data grid. We can allow resizing. So if I type in allow resizing, that'll allow the user to change the widths of the columns. Right, we'll give that one more go. I'll save it first. Look at our suppliers. And yes, we've now can see that we've got the combined address here for those various suppliers. And because I've said it's resizable, if I move the cursor, I can change the column widths. So if I've got a very long name, I can change the column width to suit. I could also allow sorting, but perhaps that's something for another time. Right, that's been fairly lengthy. The next one we'll move on to is the product form to allow us to change, add and amend products, and that'll be coming up shortly. Thank you very much for watching.